Hello fern fans, welcome to this plant life presentation on forest ferns, an introduction to identification. During this presentation I'm going to share with you some of the absolutely beautiful woodland ferns that grow in the southwest, particularly in our temperate rainforests. I'm going to show you why I think they're so fascinating and why people through the ages have found ferns fascinating. And I'm going to share with you, if you're interested, how you can start to go about identifying some of them for yourself. This presentation is part of the National Lottery Heritage Funded project Building Resilience in Southwest Woodlands, which aims to conserve and celebrate the region's temperate rainforest habitat and the important lichens, mosses, liverworts and ferns that grow there. It's a partnership project, and you can see on this slide all of the key partners who are involved in this project and who are working towards improving our temperate rainforest habitat. So what are we going to cover? Well, we're going to look at why people find ferns so fascinating. We're going to look at some of the features that you should be keeping an eye out for when you're starting to identify ferns. And we're going to look at some of the common woodland ferns that you find in the southwest and indeed in woodlands all over the UK, so that next time you go out into the woods, you can feel confident and go out with an ID guide and have a go. There are many reasons why ferns are particularly interesting plants to look at, but for me, one of the big ones is that ferns are a bit like time machines. Looking at a fern is like looking through over 300 million years of the Earth's history. That's how long it is that ferns have been on our Earth, and to put that into some kind of perspective, there is records of early humans from just 7 million years ago. So ferns predate humans, they predate flowering plants, and they even predate the dinosaurs. There's fossil records of a fern called the royal fern from over 200 million years ago, and you can look at a royal fern now, which grows in the southwest and in lots of places around the UK, and you can look at the fossil of the royal fern, and they are virtually unchanged in all that time, in over 200 million years. And that can be explained by their slow evolution, which in part is due to them reproducing with spores. Ferns were the first true land plants. The lichens and mosses evolved before them. And they were the first to have a vascular system that enables them to transport water around them. So lichens and mosses are very small in comparison, and they are kept small because they absorb water through their surface. They aren't able to move water around them in the same way that ferns can. Ferns have held fascination for people all over the world for centuries. To the Maoris of New Zealand, ferns represent new life and new beginnings, and to the Victorians they symbolised humility and sincerity. Their mystery stems from the fact that it wasn't until the 1800s that it was discovered that ferns reproduce via spores. Until then, people couldn't work out how they reproduced when they didn't flower and therefore didn't have any seeds. Many cultures concluded that it did flower, it was just that we couldn't see them. In England in the Middle Ages, it was believed that you could harvest a fern seed by stacking 12 pewter plates amongst ferns. At midnight, the fern would blossom and the seed would pass through 11 plates and come to rest on the last one. In other tales, the devil would snatch the seed away before anyone could see it. This connection of ferns with what's seen and what's not seen is reflected in Shakespeare, where in Henry IV, Part 1, a highwayman proclaims that as he has a fern seed, he'll be invisible and therefore get away with his crimes. As recently as in 1703 in Scotland, Martin describes a cure for blindness or bloodshot eyes, which is to mix ferns with egg white and apply them to the eyes. Perhaps that one is not to be recommended. So why should we learn about ferns? Well, they're present on almost every woodland walk that we go on. They're an integral part of the woodland landscape, and yet Most of us haven't ever had the opportunity to spend a little bit of time looking at them more closely, noticing the differences between them, and learning a bit more about them. As woodland plants go, they're a good one to start with. There are only around 60 UK species of fern, and 14 of these are pretty common in the temperate rainforest habitat. And a lot of those are fairly easy to identify too once you pick up a few hints and tips. And we also have a couple of very rare ferns that grow in some of our southwest rainforests in places that are extremely damp and unspoiled. When we're starting to identify a fern, the first thing to do is to take a closer look at the frond being the large leafy part of the fern. Some of these fronds may be solid, and others may be broken up into smaller segments to a lesser or greater degree. And it's how divided up that frond is that can help you begin the process of identification. So on this slide, you can see at the top that some fronds are undivided, they're solid. Some fronds are divided up once from the central stem, and we call those pinnate. Some are divided twice from the central stem, we call those bipinnate, and some are divided up 3 times from the central stem, and they're called tripinnate. The next section of this presentation, there are some videos that show you in a lot more detail what I mean by those terms, so that hopefully when you have a frond in front of you, you can work out whether it's undivided, or if it is divided up, how divided it is.
Here we have a fern whose fronds are undivided, so you can see these rather glossy, shiny, thick fern fronds aren't broken up into any smaller segments at all. This one's got a kind of wavy edge, and it is in fact an evergreen fern. It's got a kind of waxy, leathery feel to it, but it's a solid fern and it's undivided. This little rather yellow frond is an example of a frond that is divided once, or pinnate. So if we count the stem as 0, we count out from the stem just once. These are the pinna, and they're not further divided up. These little sections are solid. So this fern is just divided once. So it's 0, 1, which makes it pinnate. So we've got this beautiful big fern here. Let's see how many times divided these fronds are. So let's take a closer look. So if we count this central stem here as 0, it's divided up once into these segments which we call pinna, and then twice into these smaller segments called pinnules. If we take a really close look here, you can see that they aren't divided any further. So this fern is divided twice, or bipinnate. So we've got 0, divided once, divided twice. Let's take a closer look at this fern and see if we can work out how many times this frond is divided. If we start with this central stem as 0, it's divided once into these pinna, twice into these pinnules, and then if we look at these pinnules, we can see that they are divided up again into a smaller segment that we call a pinnulette. And these little pinnulettes are actually quite finely toothed, and you might almost think that it was divided up 4 times, but this is a tripinnate fern with a frond divided up 3 times. So we've got 0, 1, 2, and then these are broken up further, so it's divided 3 times.
When you've looked at how divided the fern's frond is, there are some other features that it's worth being aware of. take a look at the overall shape of the frond. It might be long and thin with fairly parallel sides. It might be taper towards the tip or the base. It might be very broad in the middle. Those can give you a clue as to which fern you're looking at. It's also worth having a look at the shape of the smallest leaflets on the frond. So depending on how divided up that fern is, it might be called a pinner if the frond's divided once, or a pinnule if it's divided twice, or a pinnulette if it's divided 3 times. And they can be pointed, they can be rounded, they can be blunt, they can be toothed. And so just have a look at some of those little tiny leaflets and see what shape they are. It's always worth noticing when you approach a fern that you want to identify the way in which it is growing. This is a useful identification feature for many ferns. Lots of ferns grow from a central stem with fronds coming out of it. If you look at the top picture, that shuttlecock formation, the fronds are coming out of a stem, most of which is buried under the ground, and those fronds are very tightly clumped together and gently splay outwards, very much like the shape of an actual shuttlecock that you'd use in badminton. The second picture down shows an open rosette. So again, the fronds come from a central point, but rather than standing quite upright, the fronds have a more relaxed, lazy, laid back sort of position. At the bottom, you can see that there is a diagram that shows 3 individual little fronds and on a creeping rhizome. Now this means that these fronds are not clumped together. When you see them, they stand very much on their own. They're all connected to the same plant, but in this case, the rhizome, that fattened kind of stalk, is lying horizontally rather than going vertically into the ground. And so these individual fronds stand on their own, and immediately, when you get to grips with fern ID a bit more, that will start to narrow down which fern it might be. So are the fronds all growing together in a clump and standing upright? Are they growing in a clump but more relaxed? Or are they standing very much on their own? And we call that the growth habit.
Here we're looking at the front of a male fern frond. I'm just going to turn it over so that you can see what's going on the back. Now here you can see lots of little round structures, and these are called sori. These are the spore cases. Inside the sori are smaller structures called sporangia, and it's inside those sporangia that the spores are contained. I'm going to give you a close-up look at some of those in a moment, but actually, can you see on this piece of white paper, just having had this frond on there for a moment, you can see these microscopic little spores have been released from some of these capsules. I've turned the frond over, and now we're looking much more closely at some of those little spore cases. Now you can see in this image that a couple of them are paler and have a sort of papery white coating over them, and on others that coating appears to have peeled back towards the centre. So that coating is called the indusium, and as the sori, those little spore cases, mature, that indusium will peel away to reveal these little shiny, globular, caviar-like sporangia. And it's inside those sporangia that you find the spores. Now the shape of these sori is something that we look at when we're trying to differentiate between different ferns, and on the male fern you might describe them as being donut shaped or kidney shaped, and I'll show you the differences with some of the other ferns. We're looking here at the back of 2 hart's tongue fern fronds. You can see very clearly the sori on the back of those fronds. They're quite mature on one, the upper frond, where they're quite a dark brown colour, and quite underdeveloped on the lower one, where they're a sort of more pale silvery kind of a colour. I'm going to zoom in on these so that you can get a really good close look at what's going on there. This is the back of the frond that had the better developed, more mature sorry on it, and this particular sorus is one of the least developed on this frond, and you can see that very shiny, thin indusium, that covering, is starting to peel back to expose some of the pearl-like brown sporangia within it. I'm just going to move us over to one of the better developed, more mature sorry. And here you can see that the indusium has peeled back almost completely and has exposed these sort of caviar-like, pearl-like sporangia within it. And just sitting here watching it, you can actually see there is movement, which is incredible, which I can only assume is those sporangia opening up, ready to release spores.
Right, so we've looked closely at our fern fronds and we've worked out whether or not they're divided up, and if they are, how divided they are. We've had a look at the growth habit of ferns, so we know what shape they're growing in, and we've had a quick look at the back to see if there are any spore cases on there, and if there are, what shape they are. So it's time to get on with some identification.
This undivided fern is one that's easy to identify. You're not going to mistake it for anything else in the woods. It's the hart's tongue fern. It has these lovely, thick, glossy, leathery leaves, leathery fronds that are undivided and have these linear spore cases on the back, which are reminiscent of centipede's legs, and which give rise to its name, Asplenium scolopendrium. Scolopendrium meaning centipede. Very often the fronds have this rather wavy edge to them, and you'll find this throughout the year in many of our woodlands in sheltered spots. I'm looking up now into the canopy, and on a horizontal branch of an old oak tree I can see some little fern fronds waving around. These are the fronds of a fern called the Poddy fern. Poddy means many feet. It's a very sweet little fern. It likes to grow on these horizontal branches where it stays nice and moist. When it rains, the rain gathers in all the moss that grows there, and the ferns thrive. You do also find them in hedge banks in damp places. Now these ferns grow in quite a different way to some of the other ferns that we will be looking at. These fronds arise singly, so they don't grow in a clump or in that shuttlecock formation that other ferns grow in. You can see that all these fronds are separate. It's got a creeping rhizome that grows underneath the moss on that tree's branch, and the fern fronds pop up singly from there. Here you can have a closer look at one of the fronds of the Poddy fern. You can see that it's divided just once from the stem. It just has these individual pinna coming off it. If we have a look on the other side, we can just see the remnants of some little spore cases there. They've all burst open and released their spores. This little wall dweller is called the Maidenhair Spleen wort. It's another pinnate fern, so the fronds are divided once from the main stem into these little rounded pinna. And it gets its name from these very fine hair-like stems which become very noticeable once the little leaves fall off it. And it's another very common fern and very, very pretty, Maidenhair Spleen wort. Let's take a look at this fern. You can see it's growing in that shuttlecock growth habit, and the fronds, the larger ones, are about 1 metre in length, so it's a good sized fern. If we take a closer look at this frond, we can see that it's divided twice, so once for these larger pinna and then twice into these smaller pinnules, but it's not divided up any further. If we take a very close look at these pinnules, you can see that they are growing on tiny little stalks, very distinct little stalks, and the pinnules have what's often described as a mitten shape to them. So you have to use your imagination a little bit, but you can sort of see a thumb of a mitten and the fingers of a mitten. And that shape is a dead giveaway for what this fern is. There are two ferns that could potentially look like this, the soft shield fern and the hard shield fern. But what we're looking at here that tells us it's a soft shield fern is that very, very distinct little stalk that the hard shield fern doesn't have. And when I say mitten shaped, I'm talking about that kind of thumb and fingers shape. But if we have another close look, hopefully you can see. So that's the soft shield fern, a very pretty fern and very common in the southwest woodlands. I'm going to have a go at identifying this fern now. Having a look at its growth habit, we can see it's got that shuttlecock formation where all the fronds grow out from a central point, and the fronds are quite large. So taking a closer look, having a look at a frond here, I'm going to count the divisions. So if we say that the central stem is 0, it's divided once and twice. So I'm just going to take a closer look at these smaller divisions, these little pinnules, and I can see that they've got a slightly toothed edge to them. Also, these larger sections, the pinna, where they meet that central stem, you can see that that junction is green and not black, this piece here. And if I turn it over, have a look on the other side, that junction there is green and not black. And you can see these lovely little spore cases on the back are sort of kidney or donut or black pudding shaped. Quite a few of them quite mature and have burst open. And these paler looking ones, the more creamy coloured ones, if you had a really, really close look, you'd be able to see the insides of those little spore cases because that top cover has burst and is starting to peel back. Let's have a go at identifying this fern. So first of all, we need to see how many times the frond is divided, and I can see that from this central stem it is divided once, twice, and then these smaller divisions mean that it's divided 3 times, so it's a tripinnate fern. So that narrows down the different ferns that it might be. I can also see that these bottom pinna, these ones here, have a very distinctive triangular shape to them, and they sit at quite a different angle to the other pinna on this same frond. They sort of point in a slightly different direction, and these are all hints as to which fern it might be. Now, if we take a closer look at the stem of this fern here, the stipe, the bit below the leafy bit of the frond, you can see very clearly there are lots of little scales on here, and these scales are going to help me figure out which fern this is. So I'm just going to take one off and then give you a closer look at it. What you're looking at here is a magnified view of one of those very small papery scales, and you can see here that this scale has paler edges and a dark vertical stripe. Now that tells me that this is the broad buckler fern. I already knew it was one of the buckler ferns by the way it was divided up and the shape of those 2 lower triangular pinna, but I didn't know which buckler fern it was, and different buckler ferns have different stripes on their scales. So this one having a vertical stripe through the centre of that scale tells me it's a broad buckler fern.
Thank you for watching this introduction to fern identification. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it useful. Here are my suggestions for things that you could do now. Perhaps in the next few days, you could go for a walk in the woods and see how many different ferns you can see. It's not important at this point to name them, but more important to notice the differences between them. Take a look at some of those ferns and see if you can count the divisions in them. Is it undivided? Is it divided once, twice, or 3 times? Practice that skill with as many ferns as you can find. And then, if you're feeling confident, use your ID guide or take a frond or 2 home and have a look at them alongside this video to see if you can identify your ferns. But remember, in this video, we're only looking at a small number of the ferns that you'll find in the woodlands in the southwest. So using an ID guide, if you can, would be most helpful to you. Happy fern hunting!